Movie! Hi, I'm Connor, and this is a movie review podcast. Every week, a bunch of us have a few beers, get burgers, and see a new movie. The next day, we get together and talk about it. And sometimes it's good.
I just think it's really masterfully done.
Sometimes not so much.
This might be the most horrifying movie I've ever seen in theaters.
And then I post it. If you like what you're hearing, give us a comment, review, email, or whatever. Links are in the show notes. Now here's a soundbite from the movie we'll be talking about.
You don't know me.
You don't, Chuck Wepner.
Well, you do know me, but you don't know you know me. Once upon a time, I was the heavyweight champ in New Jersey. I was the best.
Hey, Dal, set my man up with whatever he wants.
And some guy named Stallone wrote a screenplay inspired by me. I was like, what?
It's the real Rocky.
I told you know me. The real Rocky.
This is Beers, Burgers, and a Movie. I'm Connor with Joey.
Hello.
And Mark.
Hi.
We saw Chuck, directed by Philippe Feladon. And Mark, why don't you go ahead and tell us about Chuck?
Chuck is a character study movie about the real-life Rocky Balboa, Chuck Wepner. Although it's not really a sports movie and there's not much in the way of boxing to be found here. It's a movie about a folk hero man's peak moment in his life and how he deals with it. He lives in Jersey and spends a lot of time just hanging around Jersey. And they're not very shy about the fact that his peak moment is going 15 rounds in the ring with Muhammad Ali. And the movie is pretty much just about him dealing with that folk hero status.
He didn't really fight like other guys. He wasn't a technically strong fighter, but he could just take a hit, and the movie really does push that a lot, that he could constantly take a beating and then just kind of outlast the other guy and then eventually land a few haymakers and knock the other guy out, or just last. And
They called him the Bayonne Bleeder.
Right.
Because he would get the shit beat out of him, but...
And he didn't like that very much.
No, in the movie at least. He is played by Liev Schreiber. There's actually a decent amount of stars in this for this tiny movie that didn't really get a huge release yet. I think it's going to start to get
you
make
got
more
Elizabeth
rounds.
Moss as his wife. You got Naomi Watts as some bartender. Then you got some comedian types. Jim Gaffigan shows up as his buddy.
Ron Perlman's in it also.
Ron Perlman, yeah, he's in it.
Joey, what did you think of Chuck?
So, like so many other biopics that we have seen, because I feel like half of the movies that we've talked about are biopics.
It seems like that's the only thing that isn't blockbuster cinema that gets made.
Yeah, isn't that fucked up? Like all of the we try to avoid just seeing all the obvious blockbuster movies, like the Marvel movies and stuff. Mostly because I don't really feel like seeing them because I feel like I've seen them all already. And our only alternatives are like these made for like $500,000 biopics. And all of them are like the same problem, where it's like this story would make for a great magazine article or a 30-minute PBS documentary. But a whole feature film?
Yeah, stick it into Sports Illustrated.
There's just no story here. This is a movie about a guy who's kind of a dick and then at the end realizes he shouldn't be a dick. That's the story, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that's not compelling in and of itself. Like, there's a couple of boxing scenes which are interesting. There's a couple of character scenes that hint at a potentially more interesting character than the one we're given. Or, at the very least, the character itself is more interesting than the movie that he's in. And at the end of the day, I just was, incredibly bored by Chuck, because I feel like I've seen it all before, and I've seen it done better.
You've seen it done better as Rocky. You can
in particular, Rocky.
Right,
Rocky's a far better film because it's actually telling a story.
Right, you can see how Sylvester Stallone, who is a character in this, played by some other guy.
Some guy that looks sort of like him.
The premise here is really good, obviously, and it turned into Rocky, which is one of the biggest movies ever. Academy Award.
Well, the premise of his underdog 15 Minutes of Fame story is good. The premise of here's a guy that gets really big-headed over his 15 Minutes of Fame and then tries to live vicariously through Rocky when that movie comes out. That's an interesting character idea, but it's not an interesting story idea in terms of an actual story being told. That's just kind of a framework for a character that you then have to put in a story that's about something, or a story that has things that are happening. Whereas this just kind of feels like pure character study, except it doesn't go anywhere. It just kind of like I said, the only arc that it has is he gets increasingly more like a dick, like more big-headed, until he realizes, maybe I shouldn't be a dick to my family. Maybe that's a bad thing. Like that's the story. Like that's the arc, and that's it. And like that's not compelling. It's obvious, and on it by itself, that cannot drive a narrative, which is what it attempts to do here.
Yeah, I found that the first half was much more enjoyable, especially because or maybe not even the first half, maybe the first quarter I liked more when
that's when it actually was dealing with his fight against Ali.
Right, and his rise to getting there.
Yeah.
And I thought that that's what this would be more of. Like I thought we would see more of him when he was just doing the Golden Gloves fights in New York, where he was just fighting random guys and beating them.
Yeah.
And then rising to this point. And then there would be more after the Ali fight. But the Ali fight is really early on, and then it's more of seeing how someone acts after their moment in like the spotlight is up, and now trying to deal with that, and also having to deal with the fact that you're living in the shadow of something about your life, and you don't really see anything out of it.
That you're never going to top. Like, you're never going to be better than that moment in your life.
Right, and those scenes are actually kind of interesting, where he's rooting for Rocky to win all these awards, even though it's not. It's like it's his story, sort of. Like, it's based on like his moment against like the world champ, and try to be like the everyman to try to go up against the top guy.
Well, yeah, that's the interesting stuff
right.
in terms of his character. Where like that's one of the better scenes in the movie, where he's sitting by himself watching the Oscars, getting super excited when Rocky wins awards.
Right, and it's kind of sad actually too.
It's pathetic,
yeah,
but that's why it works.
Sad,
like that's a good scene just for establishing his character. But again, like you can have the most interesting character in the world, but if the story you put him into is not very compelling, then you don't really have anything. I think didn't we have that problem with Logan, where it's like none of the X-Men movies are as good as his character?
Yeah,
and like you have that issue with a lot of movies, honestly, and like especially biopics, because biopics are literally about like these very specific people.
Sometimes they're about maybe they're more like documentary or historical movies, like if you take Argo or something like that, which is sort of in between a biopic and a larger-than-life situation.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I wanted to say, is that I wish that they took more liberties with this.
Well, that's what you say with every biopic.
Right, but like Argo is not really a biopic, but it's based on that story. Like, I feel like there could have been more they could have done with this if they just would have maybe shied away a little bit from the story. But from what I've read, this has been kind of in development for like 10 years or so. Like the script has kind of been tossed around, and they wanted to get Chuck Wepner's actual approval on it, and also they've even given it to Stallone to make sure that he was okay with the way that they were portraying him in it. And I think that might have watered it down to what it could have been. It could have been more. They could have made it a little more fantastical. Who cares if it's actually the real story?
There you don't think about Rocky. I mean, that's literally what Rocky is.
I know, it's yeah.
Like Rocky is taking something real that happened and making a film out of it, instead of taking something real that happened and making some wishy-washy character study that is a film but isn't really a film,
Well, I mean, I think a good example of that sort of watering down, or I don't know what the hell it is, but you've got these scenes where they feel like they're almost aiming for this like office level of cringe, where you're looking at it and you're like, oh my god, this is horrible, I can't believe I'm seeing this. But Chuck is just acting like he does for the rest of the movie. Like, the whole movie, he acts pretty normal. But like in, say, the parent-teacher conference scene, he's just done a bump of cocaine, and he goes into this parent-teachers conference that his wife invited him to, and everybody's freaking out. But he's just, like, basically acting normal. Like, he didn't change his character. He's not stumbling over himself. He's not acting all high or like, crazy. They're like, oh my god, Chuck, what are you doing?
Yeah, the setup of the scene is just like he's late to this parent-teacher conference. He's not paying attention to his kid. And then once he finally gets there, he's acting like, when he gets there, he's acting like a little bit maybe excitable. But in terms of, like, his actual like behavior there, it's not that crazy, yet everyone reacts to it like he's completely off the handle, and then like he's ruining his kid's life and stuff. And we're like that could have been a compelling moment if they let Chuck Wepner look worse.
Yeah, exactly.
But they didn't really. They never let him look bad enough, but they let him look just a little bit bad, like, and that's
the movie audition scene as well, where it's like yeah, he's not gonna be great, and he's looking at the script all the time, and he did cocaine right before that as well, and it still is like, well, you just asked a random boxer off the street to come in and read for you, and he actually doesn't sound all that terrible is the problem. He sounds pretty okay, and it's like, what the hell did you expect?
Yeah, that's one of the weird things I thought. I actually didn't think he sounded completely terrible in that scene, yeah.
And that's the problem, because it should have been Chuck fucked up, and now we realize that he's, like, ruining his own life with this stuff. But in the movie, it comes off as everybody else is actually the problem.
Yeah.
And Chuck is just this guy who these things happen to.
And the filmmaking wasn't... It was good, but it wasn't anything that, like stood out to me. Were there any scenes that, like, really, like, jumped out at you that were, like, really...
No.
It just seemed very...
Well,
yeah.
that's part of the problem with making a story like this. You're not really interested in telling a, like, story that makes sense as a movie.
I think that's unfair, because some of the best movies are biopics. Like, look at Scorsese's filmography. Half of that is biopics.
They are, but that's
sort of.
They are, but that's
really.
that's more of what we were talking about before with
Like,
Argo. Is that they're kind of
like
they're
you could
real.
say Goodfellas is a biopic, but
Right.
it's really not. Like,
Yeah.
most of the characters are inventions. Most of the things are inventions.
Yeah, that's the thing. They need to take more... There's Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah, and that movie also is very invented.
The way they should make these like these kind of movies that are based on real events or real people is more like the Wolf of Wall Street kind of thing, where they're clearly taking liberties there,
Which is fine.
and you can
But you
still-
have to.
I
You
know, but they
absolutely
don't.
have to.
They don't in these ones that we've been seeing lately.
And, like, at the end of the day, that's a biopic. It's just one that is made well.
Not the
It
same
is, but
kind.
I agree with Joey here.
There's
It's
kind
not
of
the same.
a
Yeah.
weird situation with the biopic where, like, obviously, like, anything that's based on real life you could call a biopic, and that's not really the thing. I think the biopic thing refers more to a structure than to a, like, is it based on real events?
But wouldn't Wolf of Wall Street still count as that? Like, it's about the character.
Well, it can be. It's not just about the character either. It's more about the way that they structure these biopics, where it's not so much about a story being told as it is about just things that related to this guy. Like, you have, like, biopics, like, for example, there's one by Clint Eastwood called Bird, about Charlie Parker, the jazz musician, where it just kind of, like, shows you fragments of his life and then it ends. And there's no real story there. It's just kind of like you see scenes about his life. And that's sort of what you get in most of these. Like, sometimes what they do is, like, Spielberg likes to take, or in Lincoln, for example, I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, it's about, like, one moment in Lincoln's life, which is another decent way to make a biopic. That makes sense, right? Like, you just tell, like, one particularly important aspect of their story and make that, like, the movie.
What about sports movies like Moneyball?
That's another one that takes a lot of liberties too. I
Yeah.
read when that one's not the same. Also, if you watch Moneyball, it's not just like scene, like structured the way the book is
Yeah.
written. It's more like, I don't know. They take more liberties there, and they also change the characters. Like the character that Jonah Hill played in that was not the real person, Paul D. Podesta, at all. They made him just for the movie, and they kind of combined him with other characters to make it just an entertaining film.
Well, I think that's the thing. Most people's lives as a whole do not make a great story. They have moments in them. They have episodes.
They can make good stories, but not good films. Like, I think films are a very particular kind of storytelling.
Yeah, you can't condense a whole life story down to a hour or a 2 hour and a half.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying, like, this would make a great magazine article or a PBS documentary. You know,
Which it
like,
has already.
Like, it's the kind of thing, like, you read about and you're like, oh wow, that's kind of neat. That's kind of interesting. This is an interesting story.
But you could have taken, like, maybe, like, just make that Muhammad Ali fight itself the whole arc of the movie.
Then you just be remaking Rocky.
Right,
though.
then it's
like,
just
that's
Rocky.
The problem.
Oh, that's the problem. Damn.
I mean, I agree with you. Like, I think, like, especially if you take something like Wolf of Wall Street, the lines are a little bit more blurred there. That is, like, edging towards biopic more than a lot of other movies. But I think whenever I say biopic, I usually mean it in a derogatory way, where I'm talking about it as a movie that's a little bit too afraid to do something that's not just telling us about this real life person, you know? And like Wolf of Wall Street, like, it's based on a real life person, but none of it's portrayed like sympathetically, or none of it's like...
I don't think a biopic has to be sympathetic, though.
It doesn't, but I think usually they are, because the people they're about
have a say.
It's usually a hero worship type of thing, almost.
Oh yeah, that's also a thing.
That's part of the issue. And I mean, like, most of them these days focus on like flawed people. This guy's life really wasn't that interesting for a film.
Outside of the Rocky thing.
Just like when you try to imagine this movie as a movie, right? Like, what are your scenes, you know? And it's like, you have a couple of compelling things. You have boxing scenes, which always tends to film well. You have that audition scene where he fucks that up.
You got his angry, like, his wife is not too happy with their marriage several times.
Yeah, and then, like, everything else is just kind of like, well, maybe he goes to a club, maybe he, you know, walks around the streets, maybe he goes to his brother's apartment, and it's like, what is the movie? You know, it's just a bunch of, like, it's not that interesting at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's funny because the movie peaks at the Muhammad Ali fight, and then after that, it just gets less and less interesting the whole way through from there, and that's kind of a shame.
It's exactly like his life. That's the point.
Stallone knew the part that was interesting of this guy's like life to take.
It's not a problem with the acting, because all the actors are really good. Honestly, like, it's not a problem with the even the look. Honestly, it's just that there's not enough of a story.
It's serviceable. There's nothing much going on in terms of like the actual visual element to make up for it. Nothing on the soundtrack. Nothing like that. So it doesn't have anything else to carry it. It has to work on its story.
Yeah, and it just doesn't have that kind of story, that kind of really gripping and interesting story. It's kind of like that's kind of interesting.
You don't even really feel bad for him or good for him or like sorry for him.
No, you don't. That's another weird thing, actually. Like, you would think that the movie would go for a little bit more pathos in his character, but you kind of just watch it at a distance. Like, you don't really, like, whenever he makes like a dumb move or like does drugs before doing a thing, like, you never feel like he's somebody to pity or somebody to...
Like, oh man, he's making a real big mistake right here.
Like, the only time you kind of sympathize with him is when you're, like I said, that one scene where he's watching the Oscars and it's pathetic because he's sitting there by himself cheering at awards he did not win. There's nothing interesting about watching a person's life spiral out of control, but not far enough for it to be like really bad. There's plenty of movies that are very interesting about people's lives spiraling out of control. Something like Requiem for a Dream, where all the characters are ridiculous, crazy drug addicts, and it gets to absurd extremes.
Or on another drug movie, you've got Trainspotting, which had a sequel that we haven't seen.
Or Trainspotting, yeah, which things get kind of crazy, right? But this is like, a guy is kind of an asshole. He's a dick to his family. He does cocaine sometimes, and that's about as bad as it gets. And it's bad, like, you don't like the guy, but it's not so bad that it's fun to watch.
All right, Joey, final rating for Chuck.
Probably feeling like a 2 out of 5 on good old Chuck here. I like it, maybe it's not that bad, but I have nothing, like, not nothing, but almost nothing positive to say about it. It's like, it's the kind of movie that I saw, I didn't really like it that much, and I will forget about completely in a couple of days.
Mark?
I'll give it a 3, but I'm in the same boat. It's just dead average, and I can't feel anything about this movie. And it is going to be one of those movies that someday I'll look and see the name and I'll be like, oh, I actually watched that.
I'm also going to give this a 3 because I kind of like the character.
All the actors do a good job.
And they really do. They wanted this to be really good and compelling, but it's just not interesting enough in the second half. Mm-hmm. The scenes of him just being in the ring, getting pummeled, are fun to me, and him just like kind of cracking jokes about trying to stay in the fight and whatnot. That stuff I like, but it's just not enough to really be a good movie. Once again, the real life story is much more interesting than the movie.
Can we never see another biopic ever again? Like, ever again. I swear to God, like, if there's ever a chance where one comes out, no matter how good it is, can we just not see it?
Could have gone to see The Circle or The Wall, guys, or Going in Style. Those are all movies that aren't biopics, I think. How to Be a Latin Lover.
Yeah. Yeah, right, Joey?
Maybe they should just stop making movies.